Are we on? I'm live. Yay. Okay, boys and girls, we're down to the last two chapters of Trixie Belden. As soon as we finish this, and you've promised me that you've either read it or listened to it on, me read it to you, then you will have graduated to getting to check out any of the Trixie Belden books from my library. Of course, my library is going to be more up and running for the rest of the year. Or until we get back to school. All right, so we are on chapter 17 now. To the close. The climax of the story, when it all gets resolved and the mysteries are solved. Sorry, I was reading it ahead of time, and I should have been to the right page. Chapter 17, Mrs. Smith takes over. Out of the corner of her eye, Trixie saw with inner amusement that gentle, kind-hearted Honey had doubled up her fist and looked prepared to scratch the trooper's eyes out. Trixie herself let out a long, pent-up sigh of relief, for the trooper, with the sergeant's stripes on his sleeves, was standing there uncertainly, as though torn between his sense of duty and sympathy for Mrs. Darnell. "I'm sorry to have been eavesdropping, ma'am," he told her in a most apologetic voice. "I saw that blonde kid sleigh-riding down the hill on the seat of her pants, and came over to investigate." His kind blue eyes twinkled. "So it was your husband who called the headquarters yesterday?" Mrs. Darnell's lower lip trembled, and she caught it between her teeth. "Yes, it was," she said defiantly, "and it was he who took the red trailer you've been looking high and low for these past few days." She pointed through the trees. "There it is, waiting for you. And it'll be the answer to my prayers if you take it away." "Now then, take it easy, ma'am," the sergeant said soothingly. "Our orders about that red trailer have been changed since yesterday. When we notified Mr. Lynch that it hadn't been stolen by one of the gang that's been operating in this neck of the woods, he said for us to skip it. Said he'd just learned that one of his very good neighbors had borrowed it, and that he would be very much obliged if we would have this fact announced over the radio as soon as possible. Go have some tea. You were telling these girls just now, Mrs. Darnell. Sounds as though you were the neighbors Mr. Lynch told us about on the phone. Guess Mr. Lynch only just heard about the trouble you people have been having. I figured you might like to have a motorcycle escort down the river when your husband drives the Robin back to Sleepyside. You can't always tell how the cops in some of those small towns might act if they saw a red trailer passing through. Might get all excited and ask you a lot of foolish questions." Mrs. Darnell's thin face turned pale, then red, then pale again. "Oh, officer," she gasped, "we don't deserve such kindness." The trooper went on as though he hadn't heard her. "And then there's the question of the rewards. Altogether they mount up to quite a tidy sum, and we boys would like to add a little something to it. I don't even have to ask the men in my troop." He reached into his hip pocket and produced a thick leather wallet. "In the first place," he said, "the disappearance of the Robin fixed those trailer thieves. As long as it didn't show up right away, the way the other ones did, the reporters in the press and on the air kept howling for action. All the hue and cry ruined the crook's racket. Smart of your husband to figure that out, Mrs. Darnell, and very modest of him not to give us his name when he tipped us off. We could use a man like that." He slipped a $20 bill into the pocket of her apron. "Just a small token of our appreciation for all the time and trouble you saved us. If ever wants a job." It was all Trixie could do, from throwing her arms around the trooper's neck and hugging him. He slapped his cap back on his head and saluted smartly. "I'll be getting back to headquarters now. When Mr. Darnell is ready for the motorcycle escort, have him drop by and just say the word." His broad shoulders disappeared through the trees before anyone could utter a sound. And then the silence was broken by Mrs. Darnell's weeping, but this time she was crying for joy. "That dear, kind man," she sobbed. "We don't deserve any of it, but I'll pray for his health and happiness every night of my life. If we could only find Joanne now, our troubles would be over." Trixie reached out and patted her hand. "I know where Joanne is. she said with more confidence than she felt. "You go back and wait in the trailer for your husband. Honey and I will bring." Mrs. Darnell smiled shyly. "I believe you do know where my daughter is. I'm glad I was right about you girls. Deep down inside me, I was sure from the beginning that I could trust you." She turned and darted away like a timid little gray squirrel. "Trixie Belden," Honey said sternly, "I'm ashamed of you. You had no business arousing false hope in that poor woman. You don't know where Joanne is any more than I do." Trixie tugged at Honey's bare arm. "I don't know, but I'm practically certain." Lost my place. "Both Jim and Joanne are not far away. Come on." Bud sat down on his haunches, mournfully, as though undecided as to whether he should follow Mrs. Darnell, be happier with a family of children than with me all alone in that big old house. "Wait," she told Trixie. "I won't be a minute. Honey's mother has just got to adopt Jim," she said grimly through her teeth. "He'll be a perfect brother for Honey. Mrs. Wheeler has got to see it that way. She's just got to." Honey came running back then, her cheeks flushed and her hazel eyes sparkling. "That's Sally," she panted as she followed Trixie around the base of the hill. "Her mother made me thank her, of course, but she was as fresh as paint about it. 'Thank you for bringing back my puppy,' she said like a little queen. 'He was losted, but I won't let him get losted any more.'" Trixie chuckled. "Sally makes me homesick for Bobby. He's an awful pest, but I guess I miss him even more than I do Brian and Mart. Oh, honey," she went on enthusiastically, "won't it be wonderful to get back home again? We can ride every day and go swimming in him and Joanne close by." "I don't know why we were both so dumb we didn't guess it before," Trixie admitted. "Remember what Mrs. Smith said about two boys who bicycled up to the farmhouse and offered to help pick the beans?" Honey nodded. "I don't see what that's got to do with it. I thought for a while that her hired hand who fell out of that old apple tree might have been Jim, but Jim is much too smart to have done anything so stupid." The neglected path they had been following came out abruptly on the main highway about 20 yards south of the entrance to the Smith farm. "That hired hand wasn't Jim," Trixie said. "But the big brother Mrs. Smith said was so husky and knew his way around a farm is. Why, honey, she even called the little brother Joe. I didn't put two and two together until Mrs. Darnell was talking about how much Joanne is like her father. She said both of them have hair that grows like weeds, and I thought to myself, now both of them have haircuts too. And right at that moment, I got a mental picture of Joanne in those patched blue jeans without her pigtails, and I saw at once that anybody would take her for a little thin boy." Honey covered her face with her hands. "Oh, Trixie," she moaned, "we were dumb. Do you think it's too late? Do you think Jim may already have left the Smiths?" "Not Jim," Trixie said firmly. "He'd never leave until the bean crop is in. They couldn't even go down in the garden yesterday after the rain for fear of spreading rust through the beans. But now that the sun has dried off everything, you can be sure that Jim is down there right now, picking away like mad." To run. "To think we were sitting in Mrs. Smith's kitchen yesterday, eating chocolate layer cake and drinking spiced grape juice, while Jim was only half an acre away?" "Jim and Joanne," Trixie agreed breathlessly as Honey dragged her into the Smith's driveway. "I was only half listening to Mrs. Smith when she went on and on about the two boys. I was thinking about the abandoned barn and how it must be down in the hollow below the old orchard. The sky was clouding over, and I wanted to get away so we could explore before it poured." "If we'd only waited a few," Honey gasped, "Jim and Joanne would have come up from the garden at the first drop of rain." "That's right," Trixie said, forcing Honey to slow down to a walk. "Let's get our breath before we barge into the house. Mrs. Smith will think we're crazy." She mopped her face with her handkerchief, and Honey followed suit. It was terribly hot and sultry, and the sun was shining through a haze that hung over the fields below the farmhouse. It can't be later than 10 o'clock, Honey said thoughtfully. Maybe it's still too wet to pick beans. Maybe they're. And then they saw them, Jim and Joanne, strolling along the gnarled apple trees in the old orchard. Perched on Jim's shoulder, just as though he belonged there, was Jimmy Crow, looking as smug as if he had solved all the mysteries himself. Honey stood stock still, too thrilled to move for a minute, and even Trixie could only get out a weak yell. "Jim!" she called, and then more loudly, "Jim! It's Honey and Trixie!" Joanne, looking for all the world like a miniature copy of her father, before murmur, "The ones I told you about. Sally stole their puppy, but she didn't mean any harm. She just doesn't understand." But Jim wasn't listening. A broad grin spread over his freckled face. "Well, I never!" he shouted. "You two tracked me down in less than a week, you sleuths, you." Honey seized one of his strong brown hands and shook it, while Trixie clapped. Jimmy Crow broke the silence with a loud, hoarse caw of disgust and flew away, flapping his wings. It was bedlam. "It sure is good to see you girls again. Oh, Jim, my father went to school with your father. You don't have to worry about Jonesy anymore, Jim, because Mr. Rainford—" And then Joanne chimed in, making the confusion even worse. "I saw you riding down a road on horseback and hid in the woods." At last Jim held up a hand for silence. "One at a time, please," he commanded. "And is there any reason why we can't have a second breakfast?" Word we said. Boys and girls, did you notice how four kids just invited themselves to breakfast in a woman's house who wasn't expecting to cook breakfast for them? No, you didn't notice that. Only I noticed that. Let's keep going. In a few minutes, Mrs. Smith was scrambling eggs, to which she added chunks of yellow cheese. As usual, she dominated the conversation. "Now, mind you," she admonished Honey, who hadn't had a chance to utter a complete sentence since all four of them had gathered around the big kitchen table. "Nobody told me in so many words that Joanne. I thought it was simpler to jump to conclusions and ask no questions, with help as hard as it is to get. Now, Nat." "My pet crow indeed," I said, changing the subject, because I knew as well as Nat did that the little one here was a girl, and that somebody had done a clumsy job of hacking off her hair. Her black eyes twinkled at Jim. "I give you a few lessons in barbering before you go, boy. You're handy around a farm, I won't deny, but you'll never get a job in a beauty parlor." She ran one hand through Joanne's thick, roughly cropped hair. "Reminds me of the mess Mr. Darnell's mane was until I took shears and razor to him." Joanne gulped and said, "When I found the poor kid crying in the woods not far from my camp, half of her hair was tangled in a bramble bush, and she couldn't get loose. I had—" Joanne nodded. "And then I looked so funny with only one braid, and I'd lost both hair ribbons by then, so I made him chop off the other brambles. I was afraid you'd take me to an orphan asylum, and I wanted to find Daddy and Mommy." Tears welled up in her big black eyes. "It was awful of me to run away and leave Mommy with the babies to take care of, but when Sally took your puppy, I couldn't stand it any longer." "There, there," Mrs. Smith said, gathering the thin little shoulders into her arms. "Nobody ever said he was, Lammy, and you mustn't worry any more. Everything will turn out all right. Just wait and see." She glared defiantly at Jim, who hadn't the vaguest idea of what she was talking about. "Do you take Nathaniel Smith for a fool?" she demanded belligerently. "I'm the one who takes in every stray tramp, dog, boy, girl, and crow that taps at my door, and I ask no questions. Although I must say for myself, I do know a man's daughter when I see her, especially when she's the spit and image of her old man as this one is." Jim's green eyes popped. "Are you telling me, Mrs. Smith, that you know Joanne's father?" "Know him?" Mrs. Smith roared. "Didn't I feed him 3 helpings of kidney stew only night before last in this very kitchen? And Nat insisting that I had nourished a viper until I made him walk to the gas station and telephone this morning and check with the police on the license plate of that borrowed trailer. Stolen, says Nat. Borrowed, says I. So I sent him right back to the gas station to call Mr. Lynch himself. And what does he tell Nat? The Darnells, he asks. Why, they're my very good neighbors. Please tell them they're welcome to the use of the Robin for as long as they like. She chuckled triumphantly. I would have called them in myself if our phone wasn't as dead as the doornail since the heavy rain yesterday. Joanne raised her face, and her eyes were starry now. Then my father didn't steal that trailer, Mrs. Smith? He only borrowed it, just as Mommy said? Of course, lamb, Mrs. Smith assured her. And even if he had stolen it, you had no business running away. If you were mine, I'd take the back of a hairbrush to you, and I may yet, but not until there's more meat on your bones. Glasses are crooked. All right. It was so obvious that Mrs. Smith was probably incapable of even swatting a fly that everyone seated around the table burst into laughter. When Jim sobered, he said, So your phone was out of order. Every time I got the chance, I've been trying to call police headquarters. But I thought that buzzing sound meant somebody was on the line. And what were you going to call the police about? Mrs. Smith demanded as she heaped the egg and cheese mixture on plates and filled 4 glasses with thick, creamy milk. Jim looked embarrassed, and Honey broke in quickly. I knew you'd do it too, Jim, or at least try to, after you let the air out of the tire and hid the jack. It doesn't matter now anyway, Trixie interrupted. Joanne's father notified the police, Jim, and we were hiding in the old barn when the troopers arrested Jeff and Al. Jim stopped with his fork halfway to his mouth. You girls certainly get around, he grinned. I suppose the whereabouts of Joanne's family at the moment is no mystery to you either. It isn't, Trixie told him tartly. And as soon as we've finished eating Mrs. Smith out of house and home, we're going to take Joanne there, all 3 of us. Not me, he said. I've got beans to pick, and then I'm off again. I plan to hit the road tonight. You'll do nothing of the sort, Mrs. Smith boomed at the top of her lungs. The very idea, going away just when I've grown to love you like one of my 7 sons. She patted her album locket. Nat's baby picture will have to come out, and I'll put one of you in its place, Jim Frame. Jim's face turned white, and the freckles stood out on the bridge of his nose. Then you know who I am? He muttered under his breath. And why not? Mrs. Smith sank down into her rocker. I may be fat, but I can still read the newspapers. Correctly, there was a story on the front page about a missing heir just about a week ago today. The nephew of one James Winthrop Frayne of Sleepyside, I recall. It is none of my business why you want to run away from $500,000. But when you knocked on my back door asking for work, and I ask you your name, and you say, call me Win, and I say, short for Winthrop, and you nod that red head of yours, what else can I think but that you didn't get burned alive in that fire? She stopped for breath, and Honey said, It's all right, Jim. You haven't anything to worry about. He acted as though he hadn't heard her. $500,000, he repeated dazedly. Then Trixie was right. His mouth widened into a smile. Why, I can even buy my freedom from Jonesy with that much money. I'll take enough to see me through college, and he can have the rest. Indeed he can't, Trixie broke in. He won't see 1 cent of it. Mr. Rainsford, who's the executor of your great-uncle's estate, has already made arrangements to appoint another guardian. It was on the tip of her tongue to tell him that Honey hoped her parents would adopt him. But before she could begin, heavy feet clumped up the steps to the door. On the other side of the screen was the tallest and thinnest man Trixie had ever seen. Well, I found him, Mary, Farmer Nathaniel Smith said as he walked into the kitchen. Right behind him was Joanne's father. He looked so differently with his closely cropped hair that Trixie would never have recognized him if Joanne hadn't screamed, Daddy! And then we're done. with that chapter. She screams, "Daddy!" And then we're done. We don't know what happens next. We have to wait a whole nother day to read and find out what happens. And it's called Jim's Decision. What kind of decision does Jim have? Is he going to stay on the farm and work the bean crop? Is he going to run away, steal away in the night, and nobody ever sees him again? Is he going to go back home with Honey and live with her family and be adopted like magic? You'll have to wait and find out. All right, hope you all having a great day. It's been kind of wet today and rainy and yucky. So I hope you got a lot of work done. And I hope it's a pretty day tomorrow. All right.